some of that was amusing. Sorry to say, quite amusing. It turned out that the scientists in Germany were, quite a lot of them were really quite smart at getting money for their own research, even when it was quite useless. There was a small team of people who had a very nice, who had a very nice little castle not far from Weimar, I think it was. This was at the stage when the Americans had occupied Thüringen and the Russians had not yet moved in. And they had succeeded in convincing Göring's Reichsluftministerium that atmospheric electricity might pose a danger to German aircraft. So they spent a very happy war in the countryside of Thüringen doing research, doing totally useless research on atmospheric electricity with funding from the Air Ministry. One of the curious things about England is that they were very good at anthropology and hopeless at sociology. Why? Because for them, anthropology was the sociology of other people. And the question was, why don't other people behave like us? And, so that this was why other people were worth studying. I mean, we just behave. We just run things in a reasonable way. And these funny people in the Kalahari Desert and Brazil and other places, no, that really needs to be understood. So, I mean, I'm being silly about this, but there's something in it. I mean, in fact...
It also infected you, or...
Well, one has to... yes, I mean, people in England in my generation were not brought up to think in terms of social structure. We were not brought up to think critically. With some kinds of injuries, for instance, people can be in a state in which you can dictate them something, a passage, which they can then write down as you dictate it to them. But immediately after that, they cannot read back to you what it is they've just written. I mean, we don't know what it would like to be like that. It would be for us, like not being able to imagine what it was like to be a swallow, or to have the experiences of a different species.
En E.M. Forster, de schrijver en kennis van Toulmin in Cambridge, ooit.
I remember a friend of ours he went to stay with, and he had one of those glass biscuit jars which she'd put by his bed, and she gave him a packet of biscuits to put in his biscuit jar. And then when she called him down to dinner, he was a bit late, and she asked him what was up. He apologized. He said he was late because he found the biscuits were slightly too big for the jar. So he'd had to nibble around the edge of all the biscuits in order they would fit in the jar. This is a sort of a very curious but characteristic picture of him. I mean, he set himself a task, but it was one which could only be solved in a childish way. And it didn't occur to him for a moment that he couldn't perfectly well use the childish way of solving the problem. Harry Truman, I remember reading in a book of reminiscences of him, which was published about him. Harry Truman used to say that his favorite reading was Plutarch's Lives of the noble Greeks and Romans. Why? Because he learned more about his political contemporaries from Plutarch than he did from any other source. I mean, he found people in the political realm behaving in just the kinds of ways that Plutarch describes, and he found he found Plutarch a useful book to read from this point of view. There was a wonderful conversation I had heard repeated. Allegedly, Alistair MacIntyre visited Magdalen College, Oxford, and had dinner with Peter Strawson there. And it is said that at a certain point in the evening, Peter Strawson turned to him and said, this is probably a distortion, but it was reported to me that he turned to MacIntyre and said, the trouble with you, Alistair, is you're interested in too many different kinds of things. Now, for me, you can't be interested in too many different kinds of things. That as a philosopher, you can't do your job unless you're prepared to be interested in anything it takes to throw light on to throw light on the central questions we're concerned with. In that kind of way, I've been very fortunate. I know of scientists who say, isn't it a wonderful thing that I am able to do what I find most interesting in all the world and get paid for it? I mean, I'm amazed that people have been prepared to support this habit of mine. I feel like, you know that wonderful story about George III going into his library at the Royal Library at Windsor. Gibbon has just published one more volume of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and George III comes in, and being a notoriously bad conversationalist, he feels he has to say something to Gibbon. And so he had greeting, Gibbon having sort of paid his respects, the king says to him, "Oh yes, another damn fat, thick, square book. Always scribble, 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 eh, Mr. Gibbon?" You know, I sometimes feel this about myself. Always scribble, scribble, scribble. And the world has let me do it.
Is the music still in your head? Because you told me that the music was around. And
yes, it is. It is. In fact, we were changing it a few minutes ago.
Yes.
Because I'd got back to the first movement, and I produced the second subject, and he produced the first subject.
Really?
Yes. No. I mean,
what kind of music was it? Is it?
It's still Schumann. It's still the same movement. The second subject is the happy one. The second subject is the one I was saying. E.M. Forster had this wonderful phrase: "The world will yet be saved, be saved." And but he produced dum da dum da da dee dum da da dim dum dum, which is the beginning of the thing. Yes, a wonderful sort of dark mixture of piano and lower strings. It's anyway.
And the text was, and yet the world
can yet be saved. Ah, yes, the world will yet be saved.
Well, I haven't read much of Toulmin's recent work, but I met him years ago, and I was impressed by his broad sweep and broad synthetic mind, the way he was able to encompass large areas of human history and intellectual development in a kind of sweeping overview.
And I think we've just met once. I do remember him saying on that occasion that if Freud were alive today, he'd be doing artificial intelligence, and I disagreed for exactly the same reasons I just disagreed to you tonight.
Yes, with him, I'd like to know what he did in the war, and maybe about Wittgenstein. I mean, he wrote a book about Wittgenstein's Vienna, and I've had some familiarity with Vienna too, and so it would be fun to talk about that.
I guess I've met him once or twice. I read a series of books that he wrote with June Goodfield on the history of science, and always had great respect for what he's done, and I'm looking forward to interacting with him more.
I've read his book, Wittgenstein's Vienna. I think I would like him as a philosopher who sees philosophizing as part of life.
I remember sitting up in bed for year after year reading books with names like The Mysterious Universe and The Restless Universe and the this, that, and the other universe. My imagination was very much seized by the whole cosmological project. But again, very much with one foot in both camps. On the one hand, I was fascinated to see what people said. On the other hand, from the beginning, I was afraid they wrote a bit like my father sounded. And I wasn't quite sure that I could go with them all the way in thinking that we knew things that they were telling as a very nice kind of fable. But the fables fascinated me, certainly. One slightly touchy memory which had a lot to do with the course that my career actually took, because my father, who was a very interesting and in many ways a very just man, who in a different generation would have been a professor of economic history, but ended up by working as a lawyer in an industrial firm run by Quakers in England. He always decided, he had 4 children, I was one of 4 children, and he decided that it was very important that we should have intelligent conversations at family meal times. So he would sort of open up topics and expect us to talk about them. The only trouble was that the moment any of us started saying things that he disagreed with, he would come in and correct us and would say, "Excuse me," and then tell us the truth. And my poor elder sister used to burst into tears and run out the room and go and lie down under her bed, and I learned simply to shut up and think about these things to myself and sort it out by myself. So that there's a sense in which my entire career has been motivated by what the French call the esprit d'escalier, you know, figuring out all the things that I should have had on the tip of my tongue to put my father right. When he started telling us things dogmatically and wasn't able to explain what the foundation was. This, in a sense, made me inevitably an epistemologist, somebody who's really, I hate to be told something by anybody unless I have a feeling for how it could be that way, why one might want to end up by saying that. And so that really is what sort of pulls together all the different things I've done. Sometimes people think I've been very versatile because I've written books about the history of physics and about argumentation and about 17th century history and about, but I feel that they're all about the same thing.
That is to say?
They're all about how we come to be able to understand the things we come to be able to understand, and just what the limits of theory are, and just how we have to be prepared to back up the things we say. And also, I feel very acutely the injustices that human beings do to each other in the name of doctrine. It's terrible now, watching all this wreckage in Yugoslavia on the basis of things that tore Central Europe apart in the first half of the 17th century. People refuse to learn from each other's mistakes. This is the gloomiest thing that I feel at the present stage in my life.
Going back for a moment to your father, did you love him? It's a silly question, but you know.
No, it's not a silly question. It's not a silly question. He was not a lovable man. His own mother had been a terrible woman. I hate to say it, just a terrible mother. I mean, not in a violent way, but in a tyrannical, in a sort of mental, psychological blackmail kind of way. Just so he had really not known what it was to be loved, and he found it. I mean, although he was not by temperament inclined to use. I mean, to use her sort of psychological weapons against his own children. The result of it was that in order to avoid using her kind of psychological pressure tactics, he kind of removed himself from the emotional lives of his children. He withdrew very much, and so that I respect him immensely, and as I go on, I see his strong points more and more, but he found the business of being part of the world of love really very difficult, and I didn't understand the situation well enough, so to say, to court him. I mean, he was just this kind of wise, if unintelligible figure who from time to time would produce these dicta, which were always sort of plausible enough to set me thinking, even though he wasn't able to explain why he believed the things he believed. But the love side was very much, I realized looking back over my own rather complex emotional transactions later in life that I grew up in a world in which, so to say, the world of love was always the world of women. And with two sisters and a mother and a nanny, there were all kinds of different mirrors to reflect oneself from, and all kinds of different ways of learning to deal with the people who were there to deal with, which was mainly women, because father was, in the back room at his desk doing his accounts. It was this. So this is really how life started off, and if there's one perception that Plato and Freud and the Jesuits share, it is that the way things start off in these respects is the way they tend to go on.
And now?
And now, now I'm rather Epicurean about things. In the true sense of, one gets eventually to the stage. It's a long, long time. One gets eventually to the stage at which your own emotional reactions are something that happens to you. You can. It's not that one disowns them, but that you have a sense of why they are happening at the same time that they happen, which means that it's a bit like skating. You stay on your feet. You don't always end up going in the direction you thought you were going to go, but you are less liable to take a tumble. You're less liable to find your reactions destroying the situation in which you find yourself. Mm-hmm. So I think to that extent, one learns to figure skate. If it comes down to the choice, I'd rather be kind than clever. I don't let myself be cleverer than is compatible with being as kind as I know how. I wasn't always like that. That's why, if you're asking me, what one comes to at the age of 70, so to say, there's that terrible series of gauche phases that you go through in which you find yourself feeling obliged to say things to people which turn out in retrospect to have been ill-motivated and wholly destructive, even when you meant well. I hate to think of examples because these are the kind of episodes in life that you can nurse to yourself for long after everybody else has forgotten about them. The kind of exemplars of disgrace that one creates for oneself. But these were all really I did once do this to myself professionally by letting myself accept an invitation to talk about the philosophical significance of Arthur Eddington's book on fundamental theory, only to find myself with an audience of about 6 people, all of whom knew much more about the book than I did. Fortunately, it was not a public meeting of any conceivable society. On the other hand, it's embarrassing to put yourself or to let yourself agree to participate in things. As a family, we understood much better than many people what was going on, because my father worked for a business that had connections in Stuttgart, and he used to go over to Germany all through the early years of the Nazi time.
So he knew.
He knew. He came back and he told us. He knew about Kristallnacht. He knew all about what was happening, and he had a very well-balanced conception of things. And so we knew Hitler was up to no good at a time when members of the Conservative Party were still inviting Mr. Ribbentrop to their country house parties and thinking that Mr. Hitler was really a perfectly reasonable fellow, and if you just made these little concessions, all would be well. That was a luxury our family never had the chance to indulge in. It was clear to us that bad things were coming.
What kind of bad things? Because
Well, a war.
mass extinction is...
That, well, I mean, you know, I'm not Jewish. I went to school with a lot of Jewish children. I've always felt as very much at ease. They share, I find many of my Jewish friends share the sort of feeling about intellectual commitments that I find very congenial. But the Holocaust is not part of my inheritance in that kind of respect. I mean, my father understood the general nature of German anti-Semitism, but of course nobody could conceive of the lengths to which it was going to be carried. And I mean, I will only say when we heard about it, we were not incredulous. It didn't come as much of a surprise to us because it was just a more horrific part of the picture that we'd grown up with. And to that extent, but alas, I don't know why I say alas, alas, it wasn't my people. And unfortunately, the more I read of history, the less I'm convinced that the events of the Holocaust were unparalleled. I think to say that is to underestimate the capacity of human people to be beastly to each other. I think.
But there's always this, this quote that the Holocaust is incomparable with anything else in history.
I know this is said. I don't believe it myself. I
no.
think there are other things that have happened in history which are as awful and are liable to happen again. I think in some ways it's a very optimistic view to imagine that this is unique. I'm afraid it's the kind of thing that could happen again, in the name of a different gospel, and with different victims. But I'm afraid there's a sort of streak. There's a streak of viciousness that can express itself through political institutions with this kind of outcome.
If there is a difference, it's a difference in form, so to say. We always had slaughterhouses, but now it was mechanically. What did this century change in your way of looking at mankind, persons?
Well, I'll tell you. Let me give you an example. This is. I mean, let me speak. About my own reactions to something which is sufficiently recent for us all still to be unclear about our judgment about it, and that's this war in the Gulf. I mean, I found myself. I mean, for this, I really had to kind of replay a lot of my life, because I was working on radar in the Second World War, and working in particular with people who were developing microwave radar for the purposes of producing very accurate pictures of the ground from a bomber. So instead of obliteration bombing, you could direct a bomb to a particular place. And of course, you only had to solve this problem, mathematically speaking, in order to see the possibility of smart bombs and all of that stuff. So that on the one hand, watching these grotesque television displays of bombs going down the chimneys of the buildings which had been chosen and the rest, what I was seeing was a fulfillment of things which had been an intellectual dream in 1943.
Your own dream, partly.
A dream of a group of people of whom I was one. A dream in which I was sharing I mean, another time I might talk about what it felt like to be part of that at that time. But as to now, what I found is that it was fascinating to see American military technology doing the things which had been only a sort of professional fantasy.
Theory.
No, more than a theory. I mean, you knew exactly how it would be done if the mechanisms were available, but...
Now you saw it.
I'm sorry?
And now you saw it.
Well, I mean, now I saw it, yes, now I saw it. On the other hand, I felt such deep disapproval about the whole operation on sort of larger grounds of history and policy that that it was, I found myself rather torn between the technical fascination and admiration and the deeper disagreement with the policies both that had led up to this. The fact of the matter is that, I mean, what is now becoming plain, and it's very interesting that George Bush is not trying to campaign on the basis of his own role as a war hero, because by now everybody knows that under his leadership, American policy was supporting Saddam Hussein very strongly, and that in fact, on the radio this morning, Alistair Cooke, in his letter from America, was talking about the fact that people in the State Department and in the Defense Department tried about 1988, 1987 to get the American government to admit that Saddam Hussein was trying to make a nuclear weapon. And they could not get the message through because the top levels of the Bush administration didn't want to hear it. It was so incompatible with their feeling that Saddam was at any rate better than the Iranians. So, so that in fact now the material is all there, and the lengths to which the American administration, the federal government, lent its support to Saddam Hussein, in spite of the fact that people in the administration understood perfectly well what he was up to. I mean, this represents a sack of rats which the Republican Party daren't allow to have opened.
But at the moment, the bombs are reaching the ground or the buildings.
Well, we know that
high tech.
We know now, of course, also that was so in a much smaller proportion of cases than we were encouraged to believe at the time.
But you're looking television. You're looking.
Yes.
And in 1943, you discussed about the
I'd rather
possibilities
see-
now shown on television.
I mean, if one has to have the choice between that and carpet bombing of population centers, if one has to have the choice, then I'd rather have it done accurately than randomly. I mean, to that extent.
But how were you looking at that moment? Was there the old love again, your old profession, your first study?
No, the irony was, it was impossible to see it without being conscious of the irony from the word go. The years didn't fall away. I didn't find myself sort of thinking, oh, what fun. It was in some ways very interesting to see, more than interesting, it was fascinating to know that we'd already conceived of this possibility, even though it was unrealizable without, at the very least, transistors, which were only invented in the 50s. And so that to that extent it was, the element of irony was built in from the beginning. On the other hand, even during the time that I was working on radar during the Second World War, my feelings were mixed even then. I remember having this sense that the bombing of Dresden was out of all proportion to be justified, and that it seemed like a needless disgrace for us if we really thought that we were fighting for a morally just cause to to do that kind of thing.
What did you think at the moment you heard afterwards, or you realized afterwards, that the transportation lines to Auschwitz and other concentration or Vernichtungslager
Yes.
Were not bombed, not by the Americans, not by the RAF,
I don't
while
believe,
it could have saved?
well, I don't
hundreds
believe
of
that this was
times.
taken as a policy decision. I don't believe that there was any decision. I really don't think the people who could have taken those decisions understood the significance of the decisions. In fact, I don't think there was a decision not to bomb them. I mean, there were positive decisions taken to bomb certain targets which were seen as being the sources of Germany's power, of military power.
But why not the railway lines to Auschwitz, to Bergen-Belsen,
Because-
to Treblinka?
because people,
Are stubborn animals stupid?
I'm sorry?
Are stubborn animals stupid?
No. You're being too dramatic about it.
It's more all day.
The truth always turns out to be bureaucratic.
Yes.
But it wasn't bureaucratic in the sense in which, what's his name, the German
Eichmann.
It's not bureaucratic in that sense. It was the business of Air Chief Marshal Harris as Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command to bomb those targets which the War Cabinet told him to bomb the targets which were available, which were of the kinds that the War Cabinet decided had highest priority. And those were ones which would destroy the German military power. And certainly at that stage, what people thought was the most important thing is to destroy German military power as quickly as possible. And whatever else may be happening, I mean, delaying the destruction of German military power was not going to make things any better for anybody. In that sense, of course, the situation of the Jews in Europe was a truly tragical one. But I have never heard of anybody who was in, so to say, the decision-making zone, or even in the U.S. State Department or the British Foreign Office, who understood enough about the nature of the extermination machine, for this possibility to have occurred to them. I mean, I don't think, to that extent, I'm sure that there was no conscious decision not to bomb those targets. It just didn't occur to them that this was, I don't think the question was even raised with them. If it had been, they would have said, the first priority is to destroy Germans.
They knew about mass destruction.
Who is they?
Yes, who is
Not
they?
the same people, not the Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command.
No.
Maybe somebody in the Foreign Office.
At critical moments, we are all invisible, aren't we?
No. In critical moments, the visible people may be unable to get their message through, or may come to understand that it would do no good, they're trying too hard to get the message through. I mean, it's like this business I was just saying of Saddam Hussein's nuclear weapon. I mean, we can say they knew Saddam Hussein was trying to make a nuclear weapon. There were people in the American administration who knew this. They tried as hard as they could without putting themselves in danger of losing their jobs. I mean, this in the last resort is
Yes.
the constraint on the bureaucrat. He can make as much of an effort to get a message through as is consistent with his not losing his job. And I don't think that doesn't have to be an ignoble way of putting it. I mean, there are times when you should be prepared even to lose your job. It's easier for a politician like Anthony Eden to resign politicians always look after each other. But if you're a simple official in some foreign office somewhere with a wife and 5 children, I mean, you do your best. You tell the people who can get the message through. If it doesn't get through, you feel bad, but
That's all.
Well, what more is there? I mean, you can be a saint. On the whole, it's better for saints not to have a wife and 5 children. It makes their moral position easier to carry through into action. I mean, but on the whole, you see, people of that kind don't get into that kind of civil service job. They're obviously going to be fanatical and untrustworthy. I mean, look, we have much more to learn from Max Weber than we do from Karl Marx. I mean, the question is the nature of a bureaucratically organized society, not, I mean, when people attack technology and attack science and attack all kinds of things, more often than not, they're attacking what happens to these things once they get into the hands of a bureaucratically organized system or society. I mean, for a long time in the middle period of my life, I used to feel what I hate most of all is institutions, because I think most injustice springs from the fact that institutions work in ways which we can't control and which we only wish had the capacity of responding more humanely to the people who they're affecting. I realize now that was too easy a way out. That one has at a certain point, to try to prescribe for institutions. I mean, it's a way out which lots of people, Tolstoy takes it. I mean, there's, in Anna again, there's that extraordinary series of chapters where he has Levin go to the meeting of the county council at Zemstvo, and Tolstoy describes in detail the kind of corrupt manner in which a new president is elected to run the council. And he has Levin talk to himself in ways which make it clear that Tolstoy thinks that, the idea that there can be any morality in politics is an illusion, that this kind of corruption is always going to spoil whatever we try to do. That's too hard a message for me. I think we have positive. I think we have better examples. And but again, it requires a determination to look much more closely at what's needed and why the present thing isn't, why things aren't working out.
François Cavanagh, the French writer, said people don't don different masks in peace or in war or in bed or at work. They are different people. People who could wonderfully play Mozart, who knew Rilke by heart, or Shakespeare, could the day after kill people as if stamping forms.
I think this use of the word masks is exact. The point is, one has to learn to use masks. I mean, I think we have to study how it is and under what kinds of circumstances it is that people learn to dissemble, learn to put a different face, learn to put a misleading face on their actions, or indeed how their personalities become dissociated. I mean, this is itself a product. This isn't, so to say, a genetic expression. I mean, what seems to me, here again, of course, what I'm seeing this as part of is a general tendency to think of people's personalities and actions as coming from the outside in rather than as being constructed from the outside. And in general, my own perception of it is that people develop these kinds of dissociated personalities or develop this habit of wearing masks in characteristic kinds of situations which we need to know more of. I'm not seeking to excuse them. I'm only saying if we want to understand what different kinds of evil people there are, we need to understand in what different kinds of ways
We
the world,
ourselves
we
behave.
ourselves can create evil people, or we ourselves are participants in the sorts of situations which bring out the potential evil, which actuate the potential evilness in
Did
people.
you experience certain situations in your own life where suddenly you found yourself in the morning in the shaving mirror and said, Steve Toulmin, you really are a bastard and I didn't know about it?
I've never been a violent person, and I suppose I hate and despise violence, partly as a way of excusing other defects. But I've certainly been forced to recognize times when I treated people very unfairly, or in ways that I felt remorse about. Of course, one doesn't go through life without that. The details. I mean, I've been married more than once, and to some extent my matrimonial misadventures have been products of my own failures and my own inabilities to deal with situations which I hope in retrospect, from my age now, I wouldn't have got into in the first place, but if I had done, I would have been able to behave less gracelessly in a way which was less unpleasant to my partners. I've also been on the receiving end, but that's another matter. It was a strange spectacle. He would come into class with scarcely more than the desire to state a question for people. And even to state the question was something which took him about 3 minutes. And he would begin stating it, and he would break off in the middle of a sentence and struggle with the question of how he was going to end the sentence. And this always caused him great difficulty, but the most important thing was to understand that what we were seeing was somebody who was applying to his own thought and his own ways of expressing himself standards higher than we understood. So that it took time, but what we who were in his class, those of us who stayed with the class, what those of us who stayed with the class came to understand eventually was why he found it so hard even to frame a philosophical question. I sometimes use the image of a slow bicycle race. When I was a child, I remember we had not only bicycle races when we tried to go faster than each other, but also bicycle races in which we tried to go slower than each other. And the point about the slow bicycle race was to go the minimum amount of distance without actually falling off. I think of Wittgenstein's philosophy lectures as being like a slow bicycle race. He was an absolute master. You may think that you can go straight from A to B. I'll show you that you can't even go from A to A prime. The things which people took as self-evident, he showed were based on all kinds of unjustified assumptions. You can see that with Father behind me, this was meat and drink for me. I mean, it was very much, understanding what the view of language was, what the view of how language and thought and mental habits and the rest, how these all fitted together, how these so easily led us into deceiving ourselves, into thinking that the mind is essentially in the head, or whatever it may be, coming to understand these things was something which I found very liberating, and it gave me a kind of sense that the sort of skepticism which had come naturally to me hitherto was in fact something for which a decent intellectual account could be given. And it's an account which later on I found in Montaigne, in the Apologie de Raymond Sebon, where he explains the position of Sextus Empiricus and Pyrrho in antiquity, which again was to the effect that if you find yourself compelled to ask a philosophical question, the thing to do is not to try to answer it, because whether you assert something or deny it, you're making the same mistake. What you have to do is to ask yourself, now why should I want to put it that way? Why should I think that this is the question? And then when you stand back, you learn to understand better what are the kinds of intellectual confusions of which philosophical questions of the sort that Descartes and people landed us with, out of which they have been bred.
What are beautiful answers we have enough. Hundreds and thousands of answers we have.
Yeah.
Formulating the most beautiful question, analogous to Plato, so to say. Isn't that the main goal, finally?
Well, certainly I realize that this spectacle of a man struggling even to get a question stated, that this was a sign, this was a mark of an extraordinary talent. And if that's what it's like to be a great philosopher, he was a great philosopher. And you're right to ask, but always be self-critical about what you're asking. Always dig below what you first think you can ask and understand how much else you're already taking for granted, and then go back behind that and, so to say, strip yourself clear of the unjustified assumption.
Die mythe van Descartes en de zijnen fascineert Toulmin al decennia, zoals die andere mythe uit de tijd van Descartes. Dat ons bewustzijn een ding in ons hoofd is. Dat het binnen in onze schedel wordt gevormd, in plaats van door de wereld buiten.
What he convinced people of was the idea that if only we pursued some kind of abstract rational method, we would be able to find general recipes for getting ourselves out of these difficulties. Or this was what they carried away. Descartes was quite a subtle, of course he was a subtle man, and if you look at what he says, it's clear that his personal ambitions were much more qualified and much better understood than those of his followers. But the general impression people carried away was that there was this art of being rational, which was going to be going to provide us with general procedures for solving not only intellectual problems, but also, as time went on, people thought technical problems and practical problems as well. And I think that's the idea that there are some kind of general intellectual recipes for dealing with problems. What, when I was a young man, was called the scientific method.
And very seductive.
Very seductive. No, very seductive, and especially for people who see the world falling apart around them.
Yes. What were the main, if you look back, and you should, in one page, for instance, describe what were the illusions of the Cartesian theater and what were finally the big mistakes and failures? What kind of metaphor comes to your mind? What kind of...
Well, I'll tell you a metaphor that comes to my mind. I had a student working with me who wrote a very interesting paper for me. It was about the transition from the apron stage to the proscenium stage, which takes place at precisely this time, precisely between 1600 and 1640. Shakespeare worked with an apron stage. When you saw a Shakespearean play, what you did was to see a slice of life which was going on among you. The audience was all there, and this slice of life was going on just there. In the proscenium stage, there is a curtain, And at a certain point, the curtain is drawn apart, and you are revealed a mysterious set of things going on in a world apart from you. And I think this is, and I think that many of our images of the mind, again, are images which are closely associated with this proscenium idea. Everybody is, so to say, everybody presents a kind of stage face to us. And, what is going on in his mind is like what is going on behind the curtains of the proscenium stage. We no longer feel that the things that go on within us all are part of a public era, a part of a public activity. So, I mean, if this seems to me to be, so to say, a key intellectual transition, it's in that John Donne poem, which I so enjoy quoting, where he says, "'Tis all in pieces, all coherence gone, all just supply and all relation, prince, subject, father, son, 'tis all forgot, and every man alone thinks he hath got to be a phoenix, and that there can be none of that kind of which he is but he." It was a curious kind of narcissism, a view of every individual as creating his own mind and personality from scratch in his own lifetime. None of this sense that we are the inheritors and transmitters of traditions, that our world is shaped for us by the things that we grow up into and which we internalize and make our own. That's what I think we're recapturing now. And in, so to say, a pragmatist rather than a pragmatist rather than a Cartesian world, I think it makes much more sense to see language and thought that way. And I think one of the main traps was indeed this Cartesian trap of thinking that the world begins in the mind of René Descartes and in the minds of all the other individuals to whom God has kindly given clear and distinct ideas. And to that extent, Wittgenstein brings us back out of the proscenium stage onto the apron stage, where we live surrounded by the rest of the world and act out the episodes of our lives in this public domain. From time to time, stopping to think to ourselves, stopping to say something to ourselves under our breath, stopping to wonder what to say without yet saying it, doing all the things we've learned to internalize, but basically doing them as part of a public world, not as part of a kind of narcissistic rehearsal behind the curtain.
Lissabon, een zondagmiddag in het voorjaar. De wetenschap van Descartes en Newton heeft het lang volgehouden, bijna 3 eeuwen. Voorspelbaarheid, zekerheid, ordening. We zouden de onbewuste wereld rondom ons via ons welbewuste, rationele bewustzijn tenslotte geheel begrijpen. Ja, als we maar genoeg elektroden op elkaars hoofd zetten, zouden we ook nog eens begrijpen hoe ons eigen bewustzijn precies werkt. De wereld als één groot mechanistisch gedoe. Ordening. Voorspelbaarheid. Zekerheid. Ik leg Toulmin één van de ideeën voor van Daniel Dennett. Dennett die meent dat we ons bewustzijn tenslotte zullen kunnen begrijpen. Dat we de dans van de materie zullen begrijpen die dat bewustzijn vormt. En dat we daarom computers of robots ons bewustzijn zullen kunnen geven. Dennett die ons, mensen, de beste anticipatiemachines noemt. Toulmin wrijft door zijn baard. Zichtbaar geïrriteerd door zoveel onzin.
Yeah, but why does he? Yes, you see, this is just the kind of thing. Why doesn't he say we're the best anticipating organisms? Why does he, why this preoccupation with the mechanical analogy? I mean, if you study mechanics now, if you were talking about the mechanics of the real world, at the very least you use quantum mechanics, not Newtonian mechanics. But the people who talk about the body as a machine have some terribly old-fashioned, basically 17th century way I mean, all this. This is something about which I could go on at length, because it seems to me that, that a lot of sort of 19th century determinism and the rest
It's coming up.
grew up out of this 17th century, out of this 17th century mechanics, which was by then already becoming out of date in physics, and that it's silly to go on using that jargon now, at a time when physics itself is very largely different. And in particular, the whole situation of predictive success and determinism and the rest is particularly transformed. I mean, you have a mill stream which flows steadily. At a certain point, it breaks into turbulence. Why does this change happen? What's the difference between turbulent motion and smooth motion? We were taught to believe that turbulent motion is just a special case of smooth motion.
Yes.
But there are too many variables. It's not convenient to study. It's easier to study smooth motion. Things of this kind, and so that there was a certain determination to go on insisting that everything was basically universal and uniform and governed by constant laws and intelligible in the kind of way the planetary system was intelligible. This was the kind of. I mean, when I'm feeling kindest, I'll say this was a methodological assumption or a methodological program. When I'm not feeling so kind, I'm inclined to say this was a convenient get-out, which would have compelled people to face some very difficult philosophical questions if they'd accepted the reality of these turbulent motions and things. I mean, I find it very interesting. I'd watched the weather map on the television, on the weather program on cable television in America. You see a clear blue sky, you see a storm beginning to form. Why does that storm begin to form at precisely that point, at precisely that time? They tell us if only we knew the exact temperature gradients and the rest, and humidity changes and the rest. Maybe so, maybe not, we don't know. I mean, there are lots and lots of things that happen out of a clear blue sky, as we say.
Yeah, the world had to be predictable at your childhood. Now,
the assumption was that the world was in principle predictable,
Yes.
but the phrase "in principle" covered a lot of things.
And now, after 60, 70 years?
And now the world is predictable within limits, but the limits...
Smaller and smaller and smaller?
No, on the contrary, the limits begin to appear larger and larger. I mean, the limits are... the idea that one could possibly find out what somebody was thinking by having enough electrodes attached to their cortex without seeing them in a context. I mean, I think when we talk about what people are doing, what they're wanting, what they're thinking, what they're feeling, we talk about them, on the apron stage. We talk about them as people who are acting, who are engaged in tasks in a world which is full of other people and in which their own past life history plays a crucial part. I mean, this is what psychology is about. It's how people act in the light of their past and given the character of the circumstances and situations which they currently find themselves in. And for these purposes, their neurophysiology is a servant. Their neurophysiology is what is called into play, what they have to have in order to be able to act as they do. But, I mean, you don't find out where a car is going by looking in the carburetor. If the carburetor wasn't there, the car wouldn't go anywhere.
Oh, where are we going to?
Somebody's hand went up, and I'm afraid we're just about...
Every time I'm coming up with my question.
I saw his hand go up quite... If one were forced to spend eternity with any group of intellectuals, I would rather spend it with Erasmus, Rabelais, and Montaigne than with Descartes, Leibniz, and Newton. Which isn't to say I don't respect and admire the work that Descartes, Leibniz, and Newton did, but in all kinds of different ways they seem to me to have been very strange people. Leibniz perhaps less so. I think he would merely be annoying. But Descartes and Newton were really were rather curious people. Both of them lost parents very early. Descartes' mother died when either shortly after his birth or after the birth of the next child. And Newton's situation was even stranger. His father died before he was born, and his mother, wanting to remarry, gave him away to be brought up by his grandmother. So, he felt like a child with no parents. And Frank Manuel wrote a book called Isaac Newton, A Portrait, which was a sort of psychobiography of Newton, which made a certain amount of play with the consequences of this kind of parental deprivation, this kind of loss of an ancestry. Yes. Descartes' mechanical theory of the passions, as byproducts of physiology and the rest, I think wouldn't appear plausible to somebody who hadn't, so to say, been robbed of the basis for much emotional development by losing his mother. And I say this not in any kind of cheap reductionistic way, but with a sense of seeking to feel my way inside how his thought came to develop the way it did. I'm told that the general view is that crocodiles don't dream, but birds do. That whatever it is that's involved in our rapid eye movements, sleep, is something which the bird brain is capable of, but the crocodile brain is not yet capable of. Now, that's an interesting example, because it's clear that not everything that makes humans uniquely human is already fully fledged in the transition from crocodile to bird. So that's one way in which I think the paleontological evidence, if we were able to give an adequate neurological interpretation of it, that's how I think, one respect in which I think we could see that the transition to being fully conscious creatures is one that has involved multiple steps. And some of the steps have been quite recent. For instance, St. Augustine tells us that St. Ambrose of Milan used to sit on the steps of the cathedral at Milan and read through the Missal to himself or the Bible to himself, so fast that the people who looked at him decided that he must be a magician. Why? Because he was, as we say, reading to himself, which meant it was possible for him to get information off the page faster than he could have read it aloud. And this was not part of people's general art. Sorry, I can tell this story again, the exterior noise. Okay? So St. Ambrose was able to read to himself so fast that the people who looked on couldn't understand how he could do it and thought he was a magician, because hitherto, when people talked about reading to yourself, what they thought of was, so to say, reading under your breath, as one says in English, reading, so you say the words to yourself, but so quietly nobody can hear you. I'm sure that's what a Trappist monastery was like. It isn't that people were not reading at normal speed, it was that they read so quietly that other people couldn't hear them. They may even have been reading aloud, but the important point was they didn't communicate with the other monks in the monastery. They were required each to say Mass independently of the others. Now, in this respect, therefore, I think there are good reasons for thinking, and there are many more which have to do, e.g., with the development of manuscript writing and the ways in which breaks were introduced between sentences and paragraphs and so on. There is good reason for thinking that before St. Ambrose, and even for quite a while after St. Ambrose, what we think of as reading to yourself was not part of the generally shared cultural heritage. And I think to the extent that thought is the result of internalization, including the internalization of the ability to read and think and so on, I think that to that extent, many of the aspects of what we call consciousness are in fact a cultural product, an historical product. An historical product which no doubt was possible only for creatures with certain kinds of brain, but nevertheless, something whose appearance we can find at a certain point in the history of human cultural development. So, for me, there isn't a single consciousness which is this miracle which distinguishes human beings. That the idea of a consciousness being this kind of unitary function seems to me in its own way the Cartesian mistake repeated with the word consciousness substituted for the word brain. You can find this, by the way, already in Bertrand Russell's autobiography when he talks about himself as a young man of 17 or 18 being driven, as he says, to the conclusion that consciousness is an undeniable datum. I think that consciousness is an undeniable part of our experience, but that that this undeniable fact of our experience is itself a very complex one, and that we need to know much more, partly from the paleontologists, partly from the neuroanatomists, partly from the cultural historians, before we shall be in a position, partly from cultural anthropologists, because it may well be that this is something that varies. In fact, there's a fascinating thing by Luria in which he shows that the same brain injury produces different psychological effects in people who grow up with Chinese, with an ideographic language, from what they do in people who grow up with an alphabetic language. That thinking to yourself is a different process for people whose primary language is ideographic.
Gould, die een favoriet citaat heeft van Charles Darwin. Wat een boek zou het hulpje van de duivel kunnen schrijven over de lage, wrede, gruwelijke en vooral verspillende gang van zaken in de natuur.
I mean, those things you quote him as saying about nature, by God, if those don't apply to human beings as well,
Yes.
wasteful, brutal, horrid, I think calling behavior brutal is very unjust to the brutes. I mean, human beings like to unload onto the other animals blame for their capacity to act, as we like to say, inhumanly.
Yes.
I mean, the animals by and large have just as much social cohesion, just as much capacity for mutual aid and so on.
L'animal méchant par excellence.
Yeah, well, quand on l'attaque, il se défend. No, it's not only that. It's that even more. Yeah. Oh no, that's a very nice example. Yes, but I mean, because indeed human. But I think in more general terms, the whole notion of brutality, the whole notion of inhumanity, as though humans invariably acted in a way higher than that of, loyal beasts and kindly animals. I mean, it seems to me that it's not so. I mean, Androcles and the lion, these stories, antiquity was full of these stories about creatures of other species coming to the aid of human beings and feeling themselves as part of a community. They say, this is not part of my own experience, they say that, there are people who swim alongside dolphins who go in boats out with the dolphins, who do end up in a kind of social relationship with the dolphins. I mean, that when we are nice, when we are kind in the presence of dolphins, that they are prepared to accept us into their community and to let us join in their play and join in their collective activities. That for me is not a sign that there's something mysterious about dolphins. This seems to me to be what one would hope to be the case. But it's not part of any picture in which all animals except humans are written off as brutes and purely mechanical.
No.
When I lecture about
There's
Descartes,
cosmic arrogance and nothing else.
it's worse than that in a way, yes. I mean, quite often when I'm teaching, I take my dogs into class and they sit quietly while I lecture. But I don't like to take them in when I'm lecturing on Descartes, because I'm compelled to say that Descartes thought the dogs were merely machines. And this is an insult I'm not prepared to expose them to in my presence. I mean, I think it, and the one thing I'm quite sure is that Descartes never owned a dog. I mean, he couldn't have said the things he said about animals if he'd had any kind of first-hand experience of the attempt to live on a kind of social basis with creatures of other species.
If you are going back in a certain way to Aristotle, is one of the reasons, perhaps, a certain boredom about philosophy?
Oh, I think what I'm doing is philosophy. I think it's what would have been called philosophy for much of the history of philosophy. Yeah. I do really regard this digression that began with Descartes as the pathology, as the pathological phase. What was exciting, of course, was the fact that Descartes was doing not one thing but two things. He was launching mathematical physics, but also sticking us with this particular epistemological agenda. And the development of mathematical physics has gone ahead splendidly, but the epistemological agenda has turned out to be to lead us into a prolonged dead end. So it's not that I don't see myself. I mean, I think what I'm doing is philosophy. I'm bored with seeing the same old mistakes being repeated again and again, and I wish with some impatience that what seemed to me to be the kind of emancipatory aspect of Wittgenstein's teaching was making more progress. I mean, poor old Wittgenstein, he thought he'd been sent into the world to make it unnecessary for there to be philosophers. I mean, he had this picture of himself as Hercules cleaning out the Augean stables, after which nobody would need to ask these questions anymore. He would be horrified if he came back to life now and saw that there are more professional philosophers now than there ever have been in history. And most of them are making precisely the kinds of mistakes he was trying to rescue the intellectual class from. I mean, this raises an interesting question because, I mean, at this point, I mean, you were asking about Wittgenstein earlier, and it's very helpful, I think, from some points of view, to put Wittgenstein alongside Tolstoy. If you read Anna Karenina, there are chapters which Tolstoy devotes to making Katavasov, I think he's called, making his professional philosopher friends look ridiculous. And I think he does so for the same reason that Wittgenstein did. And Wittgenstein learned a lot from Tolstoy because for both of them, no philosophical thesis was of any use unless it was of some use.
And that's your connection also at this moment.
Yes. I think theory has to be justified as a form of practice. It isn't that practice has to answer before the high court of theory.
Was this seduction also present in the beginning of your career, so to say? That
oh, surely. No. I mean, this whole enterprise of mine in the last 10 years of finally coming to terms with what I suppose one might call the primacy of practice. The primacy of practical thinking and so on, so that even the pursuit of theories seems to be itself a kind of practice and needs to be understood as such. I mean, this is something which for me is as much coming to terms with the extent of my own interest in being seduced by dreams of theory. As I said, at the age of 11, there I was sitting up in bed reading these books about cosmology, and they were very seductive.
Yes.
And that whole picture of the human mind making these great leaps and achieving these wonderful all-embracing discoveries was very. It would have been very nice if it had been so. And it was in some ways, in some ways one always, to some extent, has a sense of loss. But the right thing to do with a sense of loss is to understand why you feel it. Mm-hmm. It's not to pretend that there hasn't been a loss. For me, the central question is still the question about what we should be doing rather than what we should be thinking. Montaigne has this nice passage where he says he does his best never to do things that he's not prepared to speak about, and I think that this is a kind of measure I would like to be able to apply to myself. But this, of course, after a time involves having the opportunity to avoid getting yourself in situations in which you're liable to react in ways that you find hard to speak about, and certainly impossible to account for afterwards. This again is part of the what Epicurus told everybody that they ought to practice. Detaching themselves from their feelings, looking at their feelings as something that was just happening to them rather than something that they were doing, learning to adopt a sufficient distance from your own feelings so that you could give an account of them and perhaps even circumnavigate them if you recognized a situation of danger.
If you recognize.
If. You can't guarantee that you'll recognize them, no.
No.
On the other hand, I suspect that we do get a bit better at it.
A little bit.
A little better.
Yeah.
The world is made up of getting a little better at things. There aren't any universal solutions. There are no guarantees. This is part of it.
We schuiven met neergeslagen ogen en achterwaarts een nieuw millennium binnen. Zonder te weten waar we ons eigenlijk bevinden.
That's my question. Yes.
What is the answer?
But then the we there is the we there is a collective we. I mean, there are lots of individuals who are asking precisely those questions. It's the George Bushes of the world who have only very old-fashioned ways of dealing with these questions, and the institutions are only in course of construction, which will allow us to deal with the world on a collective basis. But this is quite different from.
It's only George Bush's affair, or I see so many people around just doing what you're describing here, with eyes lowered, backing into a new millennium.
Well, I
Even
know.
my best friends, you know what I'm talking about?
Well, all right. Well, I mean, I'm sure that's true, but 30 years ago there was hardly anybody thinking about the environment. These things do change. One tries to draw people's attention to new questions, or to questions that they ought to be asking. One of the most extraordinary things I've lived through, which I still feel very good about, basically, is the fact that in the last 30 years or so, basically since the publication of Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring, we really have been able to develop the argument about ecology, about the environment. It's extraordinary, really. I mean, Rachel Carson, if she were to come back to life, she would have to feel a certain quiet pride in the fact that scarcely a government in the world now dares be without some ministry taking care of environmental questions. I mean, in 1930, nobody would have thought of having a minister for the environment, and these things were not really. I mean,
but if you only have a minister and the woods are dying, nevertheless, and nothing happens, just
things aren't happen. I mean, it turns out that that it's very difficult to make things happen fast enough, right? And maybe politicians tend to act under the spur of necessity. Things have to be pretty urgent.
Yeah.
But
And we are dying so slowly. The planet is dying so slow. You can't even see it.
as to this side of life, I'm fearful but not despairing. I'm not defeatist. I think that what's been happening in the last 10 or 15 years, the last 10 years has not been nearly enough and nearly fast enough, and to some extent it's been retrograde. But I do think the general understanding of what is needed is much deeper and much more general.
When I'm reading, for instance, Cosmopolis, I get a sense that you're more pessimistic than you are now. There we are, in a certain way, denial machines, backing into a new millennium, eyes lowered.
Well, that's it, you see. I think if this was the impression that got across, it wasn't really the one I intended. I was intending to be a bit more teasing people, prodding them by teasing them, than expressing a genuine pessimism. It was a kind of wake-up call, it was a kind of, hey, is this the impression you want to give people? Do we all want to look like Mrs. Thatcher? Surely we can do better than this. Surely we can understand the nature of the institutional problems. Surely we can understand the possibilities that demand to be dealt with.
We can, but will we?
Well,
There's a difference.
we will do if we pay attention.
Do we?
The question is not do we, the question is will we? Is this the kind of, are these the kind of questions which can impose themselves on people the sort of way that the environmental questions impose themselves on people in this, in the late 60s and 70s? I don't know. There are other people trying hard, but it's a very confused scene. And
The world, you mean, at this moment?
well, in particular, the world,
Europe,
the
United
world
States.
the world of people. Look, I do really. If I was half my age, I think, but still had the ideas that I've now got, I think maybe I would really ask myself whether I shouldn't go and work for Amnesty International or, one of these non-governmental agencies that seem to me to hold out so much more positive and helpful a contribution to human affairs than any of the things that official governments do. My younger daughter, for instance, who works on this Africa project, she was talking about 2 years she spent in Mali, and I remember she said she used sometimes to go out with the people from the village she was living in by jeep to the next small town, and when they got there, her friends would get down from the jeep and go and explain who she was before they drove into the town, because the people in the town would be afraid that she must be from the government. And they knew that there was nothing good to be expected from the government.
No.
Whatever they did for themselves, they did for themselves. And, whatever good they achieved was the result of their collaborating with one another. Not the government simply took their money and ran. And they wasn't, and government agents were regarded always with suspicion.
What childish questions are still with you after all these years? And where are the answers? Or still lacking answers?
Basically, the question that is still with me is the question, why are people so nasty to each other? I find it, I don't want to dignify this with a grand name like injustice. Although when I look back, I can see one of the reasons why I've come to feel so much more critical about the late 17th century is because it seems to me that much of what we now think of as human inequality was institutionalized at that point. So this is...
Why are they?
I think the only answer is that's how it worked out. And I mean, my heart very rarely bleeds. My heart doesn't basically, I mean, I feel terribly bad on behalf of the victims of injustice, but behind that is this bleeding of the heart that has to do with the fact that history worked out that way, that it worked out that people acted that way. Usually for the reasons that you were hinting at earlier, that their eyes for some way or other are shut or distracted. And that's something about which I don't know what to do except bleed. You know, one can't turn the clock back and say, if only you'd understood, if only you'd known what the situation was better, if only you'd stopped and thought. Because the situation was what it was and they didn't stop and think. And so here we are now left with this awful situation which might have been foreseen but wasn't.